And our special coverage continues. Attack on the USA. 4 airliners are hijacked, turned into devastating bombs. Thousands of people are feared dead.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
The world, shaken, recoils in horror. This is CBC News special continuing coverage of the attack on America. You are looking now at a live picture of the Manhattan skyline without the 2 World Trade Center towers. In that darkness, a massive rescue effort is underway, a desperate search for survivors. Good morning, I'm Ben Chin at News World's National News Center. We welcome viewers on CBC Television, News World International, and the USA Cable Network. We have special coverage ahead and no time for commercials. We've prepared an hour-long newscast on just one story, the attack on the USA. And we begin this early morning with a snapshot of horrific events beginning in the core of America's financial center and spreading with alarming speed to Washington and beyond. At 8:45, hijackers crashed an airliner into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. Then 20 minutes later, a second plane plowed into the South Tower. Smoke and flames shot above, debris and the doom fell below. Then around 9:40, another explosion, this time in Washington. Another hijacked plane hit the Pentagon. Then just after 10 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed and vanished in a cloud of dust, soon followed by the other building.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
At 10:10 a.m., a 4th airplane crashed near Pittsburgh. The images are extraordinary, the impact only beginning. Hundreds of the dead in New York City were police and firefighters. They were trying to help injured workers from the Trade Center when the towers suddenly collapsed. Steve Irwin has the first of our reports on the attack against the symbols of America's military and financial might.
Smoke poured out of the skyscraper, and the scene was a mess. Then, less than 30 minutes later, it happened again.
Oh my God!
A second plane was hijacked, and as people around the world watched on television, it flew straight into the other tower, punching a huge hole through the building.
And I heard a roar, and I looked around thinking that it had to be a helicopter, and I looked up and I saw the second plane hit. It had to be a commercial-sized airliner.
What went through your mind?
That it couldn't be real. Just that it couldn't be real.
We thought it was an accident. When we heard there was a second one, we definitely thought it was terrorism at that point.
There are typically some 50,000 people working every day in these 110-story buildings. Those inside began to flee while emergency workers rushed in a frenzy to the scene.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion, and everybody just started running for the door. Everybody was trapped. Eventually, when the dust lifted, I saw some light and started screaming for everybody to go out towards the light.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
Were there other people that were hurt, were lying
there? There was a lot of people hurt. They were lying on the floors, coming down the stairs. A lot of people had asthma attacks while they were coming down. It was bad.
A big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Well, the firefighter, somebody with little light came eventually, and we were following him.
And go to.
What did you do? I'm sorry.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed the light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
Did you see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's
horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
But there was an even greater catastrophe. The South Tower, its steel beams apparently melting from heat and fuel, collapsed on itself.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
Unbelievably, a half hour later, that scene too repeated itself. Floor after floor of falling debris. Billowing smoke and soot seemed to cover the lower portion of Manhattan Island. There was panic everywhere. And late this afternoon, word that another building at the World Trade Center complex collapsed. New York officials were stunned and somber.
And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists.
It's impossible even to guess right now at how many casualties there were in this attack. But it's easy to see in the faces of New Yorkers that it will be a very long time before life here returns to normal. For CBC News, I'm Steve Irwin in New York.
4 a.m. local time in Manhattan, but of course that rescue effort very much underway. The CBC's Raj Ahluwalia is there. Raj, take a look around. Tell us what's happening there.
Well, that rescue effort you spoke about is well underway. I don't know if you can hear through the cell phone, but that is some machinery that's digging, and basically that is from the urban search and rescue team of New York, and what they're doing is trying to dig through the debris, trying to see what they can find. And I'm watching the people coming, the firefighters and the rescue officials coming out of that scene, and they're walking towards me, and you can see the exhaustion on their faces, Ben. You can see the despair in their eyes. And I asked a couple of them about a minute ago what they saw, and they're telling me, it's carnage. It's unbelievable. They can't describe it. The buildings, I'm looking down one of the canyons of Wall Street, I guess, and at the end of this street is where one of the towers of the World Trade Center stood. It now looks like, matchsticks or toothpicks sticking out of the ground, and cranes above it working. There appears to be a hole in the ground. It's about 4 blocks away from where I am. And ironically, I guess, Ben, just beside me, there's a huge billboard on one of the buildings, and it's for an upcoming television program this fall. It says, "This fall, prepare yourself for one unforgettable day, 24." I guess the name of the program. And this is one day that nobody will forget. And the sign here just is a reminder of that, as if you needed a reminder of that with everything else around you.
Raj, thank you for that.
You're welcome, Ben.
CBC's Raj Ahluwalia joining us from Manhattan this hour. Well, that's the story in New York City. And for nearly an hour after that first explosion at the World Trade Center, that was the only story, a civilian disaster with thousands of victims. Then the attack on the United States took another chilling turn. Another jetliner, another collision, and this time the target was the heart of the U.S. military, the Pentagon. Adrienne Arsenault reports.
Before their eyes, the terror of New York flew into their own backyard. At 9:45 a.m., an explosion at the Pentagon.
And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked right
the military nerve center of the United States, workplace of more than 20,000 people under attack. A hijacked American Airlines 757 with 64 people on board had just left Dulles, Virginia, en route to Los Angeles. Then it changed course and crashed into the West Wing. All 5 floors collapsed.
And an enormous gap has been cut in this building.
Mercifully, Pentagon officials say, the plane hit a newly renovated and minimally staffed section of the building. But death here would be unavoidable. As the effects of the escalating catastrophe started to sink in, the United States military at home and overseas was put on the highest alert. And in Washington, a state of emergency was declared.
Everybody back. Everybody back.
The White House, the Capitol building, all empty. And by mid-morning, every federal building in Washington was evacuated, sending nearly 250,000 people into the streets. Across town, early, unconfirmed reports of an explosion at or near the State Department. On any other day, that would be crisis enough. Here, today, it just gets added to a horrible list.
Very angry. Very angry that somebody has such callous disregard for human life.
And it would continue. Just before noon, a fourth commercial jet crashed just outside Pittsburgh. A passenger aboard the United Airlines plane had called police to report a hijacking only moments before it went down in a cornfield.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal. When it come down over top of me, I seen it go nosedive straight into the ground down here.
Westline commuters were operating trains as quickly as possible.
Across the country, many Americans scrambled to get away from big cities and possible targets. Most high-profile tourist attractions were closed. Most train and bus stations jammed.
Westline Track 1. It's load and go. We'll fill them and they'll go out.
And by midday, for the first time ever, the Federal Aviation Administration grounded every plane in the United States and diverted incoming flights. As of right now, nothing will be flying into or out of here until at least noon Wednesday. And throughout this night, firefighters continue to be concerned about the Pentagon. There are sporadic fires in the building, and the one devastated wing of the Pentagon is considered to be simply too dangerous a scene for firefighters to attack aggressively in the dark. So they are holding back for the moment, and when dawn hits, they say they are going in. Ben?
Adrian, even with all of that going on, of course, the attention turning to the investigation, which is underway. And hard to say what stories are accurate at this stage, what stage the investigation is at, but there is one story in an American newspaper which Canadians might be interested in. Tell us about it.
That's right, Ben. This is a story out of the Boston Herald. Effectively, it says that authorities in Massachusetts have identified at least 5 men they believe to be suspects in these attacks. They seized a rental car at Logan Airport, laden, they say, with Arabic language flight training manuals, and indications that 2 brothers from the United Arab Emirates, one a pilot, were on one of those hijacked planes. They also are telling us, or are telling the Boston Herald rather, that 2 suspects flew to Logan from Portland, Maine, after traveling into the United States from Canada. This is obviously of grave concern, not just to the United States, but to Canada. Borders may turn out to be a big issue in this as it unfolds. We also know that as we've heard throughout the night, that INS officials in the United States are becoming quite tight on the borders, both in Canada and Mexico. So it looks like this might be what people start focusing on.
Adrian, thank you. CBC's Adrian Arsenault joining us from our Washington bureau. Well, with the Pentagon on fire across the Potomac from Washington, with 2 mammoth New York skyscrapers reduced to dust and debris, it is all but impossible to give you any kind of accurate death count. Most reports estimate deaths in the thousands. The 4 airliners alone had 266 people aboard, and there are no known survivors. A New York Firefighters Union official believes more than 250 firefighters died as they rushed to the rescue, and as many as 80 police officers are missing in New York. NBC News reports that at least 800 people were killed in the Pentagon attack, and Canada's Foreign Affairs Department says it will be at least a day before it knows how many Canadians have been killed. We do know at least 1 Canadian was on board one of the hijacked airplanes that rocketed into the World Trade Center. Garnet Bailey died in that terrible collision. Bailey was a native of Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. He was also well known as Ace Bailey, of course. He was once a Stanley Cup champion with the Boston Bruins and worked as the director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings. Bailey was on United Airlines Flight 175 heading to Los Angeles from his home in Boston when the jet was taken over. Garnet Bailey was 53. We are also hearing a lot this morning about cell phones, survivors calling out for help from under the rubble in New York. Terrified passengers on those 4 doomed planes who reportedly made frantic, secretive calls of warning. Those calls are shedding more light today on what happened as hijackers commandeered the planes. One of them, the last jet to go down, crashed, as we know, outside Pittsburgh. No known survivors, But two of the passengers apparently reached for phones in the midst of the terror. One from a locked bathroom with this chilling message, quote, "We're being hijacked, we're being hijacked." Another, this man, Mark Bingham, a 31-year-old father of two. He apparently called his family in California in the last minutes.
He just said, "I want to let y'all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again."
I said that.
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, "Well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother."
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, "Well, who are they, Mark?" And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, "I don't know who they are." He became distracted there, as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of, "It's true," and then the phone went dead.
A sign of our times, a cell phone call from a scene, no doubt of panic and fear. We have been seeing a lot of this in recent years. You'll recall similar phone calls during the high school shootings in the U.S. last year. And reportedly, as we told you earlier, families and emergency personnel are getting cell phone calls this morning from under the debris of the World Trade Center towers. Hopefully those can lead rescue crews to help the people making the calls. U.S. President George W. Bush was not in Washington at the time of the Pentagon attack, but as you may have seen, he is there now, and he is assuring the nation that even though a powerful symbol of the U.S. government has been attacked, the government itself is still operating smoothly. With more on the American president's response to the attacks, here's the CBC's David Halton.
Kite. Yes, kite. Get ready.
It's just after 9 a.m. President Bush is at an education event when an aide gives him the first whispered news of the New York bombings. His face clouds with anxiety.
At the count of 3, everyone should be on page 1.
Minutes later, his first official response.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
For more than 3 hours, though, as U.S. forces at home and abroad are put on the highest alert, nothing more is heard from Bush or any other senior official. Public fears aren't eased when Bush flies to an Air Force base in Louisiana, apparently still unsure that it would be safe to return to Washington.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
A terrible, terrible tragedy has befallen my nation, but has befallen...
More words of defiance from Secretary of State Colin Powell on a visit to Peru.
They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy.
As thousands flee downtown Washington,
Clear down the whole area.
There's confusion, shock, and disbelief.
We can't move. We can't get anywhere. Everybody's concerned that there might be other buildings targeted.
Now I know what my parents felt like on Pearl Harbor Day.
It's really inconceivable to us that someone would do that, and so you really can't understand the enemy.
But in this case, was the enemy Osama bin Laden? U.S. officials already say bin Laden is their prime suspect, that only his terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, has the resources and sophistication to carry out today's coordinated attacks. But in Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, representatives of the Taliban government denied that he's involved.
We strongly condemn it. We want investigation to be carried out.
We could hear detonations coming from that northern area as well.
Later, explosions and rocket fire lit up the night sky around the Afghan capital. Washington quickly denied that this was a U.S. retaliation attack and said the fighting was started by Afghan rebels.
In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
This evening, Bush returned to the White House after an unexplained visit to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. This was part of his address to the nation tonight.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Bush also ordered federal departments to reopen tomorrow, obviously wanting to send a signal that the government won't be knocked off track by the bombings. But no one has any illusions here. It may be a long time before Americans feel safe again. David Halton, CBC News, Washington.
Well, many people in the U.S. intelligence community say Osama bin Laden is their prime suspect, the possible mastermind behind these terrible attacks. But today, a Pakistani newspaper says Osama bin Laden has issued a denial of responsibility. The sensational Urdu language newspaper Kabrain is quoting bin Laden as saying, "The terrorist act is the action of some American group. I have nothing to do with it," unquote. The paper says it's getting bin Laden's comments through sources close to the Taliban. We have no independent confirmation of those quotes. Airports across Canada remain closed this morning after a chaotic day. All flights were cancelled and hundreds of flights headed for the U.S. landed in this country instead. In Vancouver alone, thousands of international passengers are stranded. And as Belle Puri reports, the city is doing all it can to make sure everyone has a place to sleep.
Jets line up like cars in a parking lot. Some still waiting hours after touchdown to unload their human cargo. As the sun sets on Vancouver International Airport, the day is far from over.
These are just blankets. Okay, don't unload them yet, or maybe put them to our housekeeping at the far wall.
A different kind of cargo has just arrived at a nearby hotel.
You take these off.
There's 2 rooms. Perfect.
Cots, blankets, linens. The ballroom is now a bedroom. The hotel is now a home. Staff prepare for hundreds of U.S.-bound travelers now stranded in Vancouver.
Got 3 sign-in sheets, east, west, and center, with bed numbers.
We have 50 pillows and 120 sheets coming in from Whistler as well.
300 extra guests are expected. The hotel kitchen braces for the onslaught. Those who arrived on the first of the 35 jets rerouted from the U.S. to BC have filled the hotel's 400 rooms. All that's left is dorm-like accommodations in what normally are meeting rooms.
We've set up televisions and seating areas so people can watch the news, keep updated on things. They will be using our public washrooms that we're going to fill full of amenities and towels and that kind of thing, and we put bathrobes in there so they'll kind of be looked after from that perspective.
We have toothpaste, toothbrushes, little kids' toys, diapers, blankets, towels, whatever they could send. What are you short? Pillows. Desperately need pillows.
It's been countless hours of sitting in airplanes and waiting in the airport.
In beds number 9 and 10 on this side.
Okay.
9 and 10.
They hope it's not too long before they can head off to their original destinations. But for now, the journey has ended. Belle Puri, CBC News, Richmond, BC.
And much the same scene on the other end of the country this morning. International flights bound for the U.S. now parked at airports across Atlantic Canada. Thousands of passengers, mostly Americans, are in hotels or sleeping on church floors, all of them watching and waiting for news from home. CBC's Jane Adey has more from St. John's.
They haven't told us, but we're going on this bus.
You're going on a bus?
Right.
Where they would sleep last night wasn't the biggest unknown for Tony and Newt Rutter of North Carolina. They spent hours in the air and hours sitting on a runway, and they still didn't know exactly what happened in their country.
I'm angry. I'm
still haven't
shocked. Right. We just what we've heard. I mean, and we don't even know how much of that is true.
They were 2 of 4,000 confused passengers to land in St. John's. The city's emergency response plan was put to the test. Have you ever had to deal with anything of this magnitude?
Absolutely not.
You guys are all getting a place to sleep tonight. That's good news.
Thank you.
Something to be thankful for after a day filled with terror.
Imagine fathers, mothers, maybe brothers, sisters, children. I was thinking actually the whole day about them, not about myself.
Volunteers at the local university did what they could to ease the strain on tired travelers.
And the guy came over and got the proctor to ring the bell. Everyone came down, and he said, anything you can do to help is appreciated. And There's 90 people in the house and 63 of us volunteered.
Churches all over town opened their doors to the accidental visitors, determined to shed some light on a dark day.
There's a very few people responsible for what happened earlier in the day, and there's a very great many people who want to do something to right in some way a wrong that's been done.
Okay, great, huh? It's better than Holiday Inn.
But for some, even the promise of a good night's sleep wasn't as powerful as the need to know.
I'd like to watch the news, actually.
It's not one of those things you dream up. It's just like a sci-fi movie.
Like a movie, but all too real, making a lot of people temporarily stranded here appreciate what they do have. Jane 80, CBC News, St. John's.
We've talked about this a lot, rumors and speculation swirling about who could have masterminded this attack. Many intelligence experts, as we said, believe Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect. That has the Muslim community in this country fearing a backlash. CBC's Margot McDermott has that story.
Evening prayers at the Al Rashid Mosque. Silent words for victims of yesterday's terrorist attack, and fear for Muslims living here in Canada.
Stress for them to be calm and to just walk away, because they're going to be, it's very tense and they're going to be picked on.
North America's first mosque was established in Edmonton. It has one of the country's largest Muslim communities. But even so, the Canadian Islamic Centre is warning of a possible backlash against Muslims in this city and across the country. This mosque has already received one threatening phone call, just like the reaction after the Oklahoma City bombing in the mid-1990s.
The Muslims were automatically blamed. And there was phone calls, and there was threats, and there was actually acts of violence against the Muslim community, but although it had nothing to do with it. So there's certainly a sense of fear here.
Presidential staffers are moved quickly.
Canada's Islamic organizations have all condemned the attack in the United States, offering help, urging members to donate blood, and asking Canadians to keep an open mind in these tense days.
Islam does not condone any form of violence. I mean, Islam, the very word, means peace.
As abnormal as this situation is, just let's take this one day at a time and basically remain calm.
But Edmonton's Muslim community knows things could be difficult for the next while. It's appealing to its own members to set an example and, if necessary, turn the other cheek. Margot McDermott, CBC News, Edmonton.
Many Canadians struggled with their feelings over what they saw and heard Tuesday. Those with relatives, friends, and colleagues in New York and Washington found some comfort in attending quickly organized memorials. CBC's Daryl McIntyre reports.
It seems a long way from the smoke and carnage of New York and Washington, but last night even people in Halifax struggled to come to grips with the tragedy.
We've been watching it for the past couple of hours, and it's something horrific that you never thought would ever affect North America.
And our prayers and our hopes go out for all of the people in America and the sadness and the great tragedy they're facing, and they should know that Canada supports them.
A science fiction writer with the greatest imagination could never have thought of something as bad as that. Horrible.
In fact, across the country, Canadians gathered yesterday to grieve and pray for their American neighbors. In Calgary, Ottawa, and Winnipeg, people struggled to understand.
This is the stupidity of people.
For some Canadians, it was thoughts of friends and family in the U.S. that brought them together, but for most, it was just a need to mourn thousands of strangers who died. Daryl McIntyre, CBC News, Vancouver.
Ottawa moved quickly in the wake of the attacks. Police forces in the national capital were moved to high alert. Some embassies were shut, and there were special precautions at one of the most visible U.S. properties in Ottawa. Here's Paul Hunter.
It's the biggest and most important U.S. government building in Canada. And so today at the American Embassy in Ottawa, they took no chances. All non-essential workers were told to leave.
Sir, can we get your reaction to what's going on inside?
No comment right now, thank you.
And those who work nearby wondered, could the U.S. Embassy be a target?
I'm really scared. I want to get as far away from here as possible.
It set the tone for the day in Ottawa, where some roads were briefly blocked off, tourists told to leave the area. You have to evacuate here?
Yeah. We have been asked by the police to evacuate the west.
Even the Chateau Laurier Hotel was evacuated because of a brief bomb scare. And like its other embassies around the world, Israel's, in this Ottawa office building, was evacuated too. So were nearby offices.
Just sheer relief fell over the whole office.
Police doubled their numbers on the streets. Hospitals and ambulances were put on alert. The RCMP says it's doing all it can.
But I can assure you we are doing everything possible to gather the very best intelligence so that we can use that intelligence to respond appropriately to whatever threat there is to Canadians and obviously other embassies and so on in Canada.
Of course, after all the worries, the evacuations, the extra police, nothing terrible happened in Ottawa. But on this day, no one's complaining about all the extra precautions. Better that than the now all too imaginable possibilities. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Ottawa.
Prime Minister Jean Chrétien says the government has beefed up security in the wake of the attacks and across the national capital, signs that this country is indeed taking security very seriously. Here's the CBC's Jason Moskowitz.
What started as a normal day on Parliament Hill soon became a day of heightened security. The barricades went up, visitors were asked to leave. Cabinet ministers across the country tried to get up to speed. That was especially the case for Lawrence MacAulay, the minister responsible for the RCMP.
Of course, I don't have the in-depth detail of every step that the Security Intelligence Agency take, but obviously we have a very strong security intelligence teams in the U.S. and in this country. Obviously, there's been a desperate, terrifying act of terrorism that we will all have to deal with.
In the early afternoon, Prime Minister Chrétien expressed sympathy from all Canadians.
Canadians show their solidarity with our neighbors, and the news to come are when we discover the number of people who died will be probably very tragic.
Chrétien then talked of Canadian security measures but stayed away from specifics.
We have talked with the RCMP, with the Solicitor General and the head of the RCMP, and with the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and everybody has increased the level of security everywhere.
Heightened security was evident over Whitehorse this afternoon. Canadian fighter jets tracked a Korean plane. There were fears of a possible hijacking, but in the end the plane reported problems because of a fuel shortage, the result of circling for too long. In Toronto, Premier Mike Harris offered all the medical help his province could muster.
I have instructed all branches of the provincial government that Ontario will provide whatever support is needed.
Alberta Premier Ralph Klein wondered if the G8 summit scheduled for his province next June should be cancelled.
It's my personal thought that it would be absolute folly to proceed with a summit of that magnitude.
That report from the CBC's chief political correspondent, Jason Moskowitz. Well, it is overnight in most of North America. Many people are still asleep after dealing with a day of horrifying news, but across the Atlantic in Europe, it is a new day, a day of high-profile meetings. Azeb Walde-Gurgis is in our London bureau. Azeb, you've got the advantage of looking at some of the morning papers. Tell us what you're seeing this morning as you pick them up.
Well, there's just one word in all the newspapers in London. It's war. You can see the pictures here. I don't know if you can see that here. Basically, declaration of war for The Guardian, which is a liberal newspaper. This is how it's being perceived here. Of course, it's disbelief, shock. This morning, Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, made a press conference before heading to Brussels, where he's meeting his foreign affairs counterparts. And he said this is an event of unimaginable proportions with appalling consequences. Of course, Britain is America's closest ally, and they'll be sharing intelligence. Basically, there's disbelief, shock here, and it's really, I mean, you can see it in the newspaper. there's no really word to describe this.
As Britain's Sky News channel is reporting on the kind of training some of the hijackers may have received, it's a big topic of discussion here because of the elaborateness of this plan. What are you hearing about this, the training story?
Well, the correspondent of Sky News in Washington was saying there's this training school in Florida where possibly the hijackers might have attended the school. Apparently, it's just $50,000 for the training, and lots of foreign students are attending that school. So it's really unconfirmed reports, but they're saying they may have attended the school.
How ironic if that would turn out to be true. Azef Wolde-Giorgis, thank you for your report. And Azef joined us from our bureau in London this hour. Leaders in the Middle East were also offering their sympathy and condolences to the United States, but as Neil MacDonald reports, there was a very different reaction on the street.
In Arab East Jerusalem, groups of people took to the street, celebrating, toasting Osama bin Laden, and generally hailing whomever managed to inflict such a lethal blow against Israel's closest ally and greatest protector. There were similar celebrations in the cities of the West Bank and in the Palestinian refugee camps of Lebanon. Most Arab leaders, though, understanding the sheer foolishness of taunting Americans at a time like this, were greatly restrained.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Palestinian extremist groups, though, issued cold denials and took the opportunity to lecture the United States. We are opposed to U.S. oppression, said this leader of Hamas, itself a group that has dispatched suicide bombers. We call upon the U.S. to take fair stands and not take Israel's side.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
Israeli leaders universally expressed grief and condolences. Israel's Foreign Minister Shimon Peres says it pains Israel's heart and urged the world to organize against what he called terror, saying several countries are known to be terror centers, and the world must not leave them free to play with people's lives. I hope the world understands today that its first enemy is Islamic terror, said Israel's defense minister. On the popular Israeli political program Popolitica, an Israeli general called for the immediate liquidation of Yasser Arafat.
What the American people
and from a former prime minister,
we here in Israel have been standing and fighting at the front line against terrorism for years, but now terrorism is struck at the heart of freedom. And this is exactly what this battle is. It's a battle between the forces of tyranny and terrorism and the forces of freedom and democracy.
And that is no doubt how the Arabs of the Middle East fear the lines will be drawn from now on, with them cast irretrievably as terrorists, and the word Islam synonymous with atrocity in the Western mind. It's probably fair to say that most people here, Arab and Jew, believe their lives changed today, and that the geopolitical lines here have shifted radically. Certainly the current Palestinian uprising with its overt Islamic dimension is going to be seen in quite a different light, beginning tomorrow. Neil MacDonald, CBC News, Jerusalem.
As we told you earlier, there are early signs that Canada may have been used by some of the hijackers, used as crossing point into the United States. Again, that unconfirmed report is on the website of the Boston Herald. It wouldn't be the first time this country has been a place for terrorists to rest and plan their attacks on the United States. CBC's Terence McKenna has this report.
The most haunting foreshadowing of today's terror attack happened in Marseille, France in 1994. French commandos stormed an Air France jet which had been hijacked by Algerian Islamic militants. All the hijackers were killed. 159 hostages were freed. 7 had been killed. French authorities said the hijackers wanted to crash the plane fully loaded with fuel into Paris, if possible, into the Eiffel Tower. The trail from that case led French investigating magistrate Jean-Louis Bruguière to uncover a worldwide network of Islamic terrorists. His work has brought him to Canada and the United States.
This cell is spreading over the world like a web, you know. So it's very difficult to grasp this new threat. But it's very, very dangerous because their target is very different. They try to target not only France, but America.
French investigators established links that led from the 1994 hijacking through the Paris subway bombs in 1995 and 96. And the trail eventually led them to a group of terrorists in Montreal, which included Ahmed Ressam, the man arrested at the American border with powerful explosives in the trunk of his car in 1999. Salim Jiwa covered the Ressam case for the Vancouver province.
Well, I see the Ressam situation as a precursor of what was to come. I see that as I mean, the astonishing part is what Ressam was saying was the number of people who are trained. For example, he stated that 60 people are ready and on standby in Italy. He named a number of groups in Sweden, number of people in Germany. So I saw that as a precursor. I was talking to a security source in the United States and just a month ago, and he indicated that the U.S. was very nervous still that something would happen and they would be unable to stop it. He said to me that these people are not going to stop, and you know it.
Ahmed Ressam easily obtained a false Canadian passport and used it to travel to the city of Peshawar in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. There he made contact with the Osama bin Laden organization and entered a terrorist training camp in nearby Afghanistan for months of instruction in bomb-making and assassination techniques. Islamic militants from many nations are trained in the Afghanistan camps. The bin Laden organization has been monitored for years by the U.S. security apparatus and the Situation Room at the White House. James Steinberg was Deputy National Security Advisor in the Clinton administration.
It's not simply a question of an individual belonging to one particular organization with one particular target, whether it's the GIA in Algeria or the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in Egypt, but rather a kind of loose network of people who have common affiliations, common training, common associations, frequently linked to Afghanistan, which becomes sort of a pool of individuals who may be available to be involved in terrorist operations elsewhere in the world.
The Ressam case has brought to light numerous connections between the Osama bin Laden organization and Canada.
Yes, indeed. There are other names, as you know, people who have direct telephonic links in Canada with Osama bin Laden's right-hand man, Abu Zubaydah. There are people like that in Calgary. There are people like that in Vancouver. There are people like that in Montreal. There are people like that in Toronto. Numerous telephonic links have been found with very sinister people and very dangerous people in Canada.
Suspected terrorists in Canada are monitored by the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, CSIS, and agents like Dan Lambert.
Counterterrorism is the main priority of the CSIS in terms of its mandate. We have 2/3 of our resources are dedicated to counterterrorism. We work extremely closely with the RCMP, with the Department of Justice, with CIC and Customs within Canada, as well as U.S. authorities. And in fact, I mean, we have liaison relationships with 130 different countries and over 250 different agencies.
What's valuable about the Ressam case is that it reinforces the necessity of this kind of cooperation. As you say, there were links in not only between individuals operating in the United States, individuals operating in Canada, but also in Europe. And as we began to uncover them, I think it reinforced among officials involved in law enforcement and intelligence the critical need for this kind of transnational cooperation.
Why would Islamic terrorists come to Canada? David Harris is former Chief of Strategic Planning at the Canadian Security and Intelligence Agency.
I think in terms of Islamic extremists in Canada, they regard the proximity of Canada to the U.S. as making Canada a kind of Islamic extremist aircraft carrier for the launching of major assaults against the U.S. mainland. And that's something we've got to remember.
Today's massive coordinated attack shows a level of sophistication well beyond what had been anticipated or predicted in the North American intelligence community. Most intelligence analysts thought a conspiracy of this magnitude would show up in the massive wiretapping and monitoring of suspected terrorists.
Indeed, this is a complete failure of intelligence. The United States, Canada, and allied intelligence services for a long time will be dissecting how such a major conspiracy that must have used the airwaves, may have used the internet as a contact point, could get through and be carried out without anybody waking up. This is havoc that has been created, and I suppose many heads will roll, and there will be lots of post-mortems conducted on how such a major conspiracy could be concealed.
Congresswoman Jane Harman served on the U.S. Counterterrorism Intelligence Committee and has long pleaded for more resources to deal with international terrorism.
What is very worrisome is the goals of terrorists have changed. It used to be that terrorists would try to kill a few people and make a political point. But as we stated in this terrorism report that I worked on last year, the goal no longer is a seat at the table. The goal is to blow up the table.
In the aftermath of the Ahmed Rassam case, there was a lot of finger-pointing at Canada, especially because Mr. Rassam was so easily able to take advantage of Canadian immigration and refugee regulations, and because it was so easy for him to obtain a false Canadian passport. There was a lot of American pressure on Canada to establish more stringent requirements in these areas, and after today, that pressure will surely increase. Terence McKenna, CBC News, Montreal.
Soon after the carnage began, people in this country were quick to jump into action. Here's the CBC's Matthew Pace.
They heard the news and saw the images, then lined up to help. Giving blood in Vancouver.
We've had an unbelievable response from our donors.
In Ottawa.
Horrified. It felt like you're looking at a movie, but it's obviously not.
In Calgary.
Really wanted to, give and do what I had to do from this end.
Canadians doing what they had to do to help their closest neighbors.
There's going to be a need for immediate care and comfort. These people have obviously suffered tremendous shocks to their system.
That will direct the operation on a national level.
The Canadian Red Cross is coordinating much of the relief effort.
Tracing service, can I help you?
Helping Canadians find American friends and relatives who may have been caught in the violence.
They really want to know, are their family members involved? Are they hurt? Can they help them?
But mostly they're doing whatever they're asked to do.
Coordination is the key thing. The important thing in terms of help coming in from the outside is that it comes through the appropriate channels and that they coordinate that.
Ontario Premier Mike Harris says people in his province and others are ready to pitch in.
We have offered assistance to the United States and New York governments. I have instructed all branches of the provincial government that Ontario will provide whatever support is needed.
Doctors, nurses, emergency workers are all prepared to offer their support.
The first and foremost thing that we'll look at is whether we can offer any assistance in the healthcare field, because the priority becomes on the living.
So people such as Aliyah Galani are just waiting for the call.
If I can just help one person, it'll be a lot, but I know it's going to be a lot. I know maybe we're going to work like 16 hours or 18 hours a day when we go there, and I'm ready for that.
Ready to help out in a relief effort that's only just begun. Matthew Pace, CBC News, Montreal.
Well, the Canadian Blood Services says it's expecting a huge demand from the U.S. for blood donations. And to find out the location of clinics and hours, you can call 1-888-2-DONATE. And to check on Canadians who may have been caught in the attacks, Foreign Affairs has a 24-hour emergency service. That number, 1-800-387-3124. Word of caution, both numbers are extremely busy. We're just getting some word from overseas markets, and they are reacting badly to yesterday's attacks. In Japan, the benchmark stock index, known as the Nikkei stock average, lost almost 7% of its value. It plunged below the 10,000-point mark for the first time in 17 years as traders dumped shares in reaction to the attacks. Hong Kong's market was off 10%, and South Korea's market suspended trading within minutes after losses reached the allowable one-day limit. In other foreign markets, airline stocks are getting hammered. Shares in Europe's busiest airlines, British Airways, have fallen 20%, while Lufthansa is off 17%. Financial analysts fear adverse market reactions could push the U.S. economy into recession. Officials at the Toronto Stock Exchange meet later this morning to decide whether to resume trading. The TSE's composite index was down nearly 300 points when trading was halted at 10:40 a.m. on Tuesday. Well, it took just one morning to change the world forever. A series of stunning attacks on the most powerful nation on earth. Here's the CBC's Brian Stewart with a detailed look at 2 hours of terror.
Early morning rush hour. Thousands of New Yorkers battle morning traffic to make it to their jobs within the twin 110-story north and south towers of the World Trade Center. Though a terrorist target 8 years ago, at the Trade Center, 50,000 are expected in its offices. Today, there's no special alert or sense of menace. To the north, at Boston Airport, just 1 minute before 8, American Airlines Flight 11 takes off headed for Los Angeles. It's a Boeing 767 carrying 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, 2 pilots. All seems normal as it crosses Newark and climbs to 10,000 meters over the Adirondacks. But suddenly, air traffic controllers see it veer off course and start heading for New York. For the next 30 minutes, alarm controllers watch an apparently hijacked plane streaking towards Manhattan. Then within minutes, they see a second plane, United Airlines Flight 175 with 56 aboard, also veering off course, aiming for Manhattan. At 8:45, all hell breaks loose above New York. The first plane, Flight 11, crash dives straight into the North Tower of the Trade Center, causing catastrophic loss of life. 18 minutes later, at 9:03, a stunned city sees the second plane swoop unerringly into the side of the South Tower, a scene which stuns the world. Even as this is happening, there's more on the way. In Washington's Dulles Airport, Flight 77, a Boeing 757, takes off for Los Angeles. Suddenly veers off direction, and at 9:38, crashes at the west wing of the Pentagon, the very command center of America's military. Minute by minute, horrors mount. 10 a.m., the unthinkable. In New York, the entire South Tower of the Trade Center collapses, like a giant avalanche of concrete and steel, burying so many wounded and rescue workers. 10:10 in the morning. United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 with 45 on board, traveling from Newark to San Francisco, plows into a field disintegrating in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. There are reports of an explosion just before the crash. Then at 10:29, the drumbeat of calamity reaches its peak. Incredibly, the North Tower of the Trade Center also collapses. An event so stunning, so threatening, that much of Manhattan is evacuated. In just 2.5 hours this morning, from the first takeoff in Boston to the tower collapse, America and the world have changed in ways still uncountable and incalculable.
Today's attacks made the world's major superpower look more vulnerable than ever. It is now a wounded nation ready to retaliate. As Carol Off reports, there are a lot of questions about how all of this will ripple around the world.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested.
The United States of America shut its doors today and went into a state of fear and suspicion. Like a fortress, it sealed borders and for the first time in history closed down all air traffic.
Oh, I think we're really off the scale in terms of any terrorist precedents.
U.S. terrorist expert Brian Jenkins says there's only one thing in American history that compares.
I think people here are reaching for the only historical metaphor that they have, and that is Pearl Harbor. This, in effect, will be the Pearl Harbor of the beginning of the 21st century, a signal event that somehow is seen as bringing about some fundamental change in how the United States may look at the world.
The United States has been the target of terrorism for decades. A violent attack on a U.S. embassy in Beirut 20 years ago shocked Americans. But in 1993, when a bomb exploded at the World Trade Center, terrorism took on a new meaning for Americans. They were not safe, even in their own cities. The U.S. government considered this man the mastermind behind the World Trade Center bombing. Osama bin Laden is called America's #1 enemy, perhaps the most wanted man in the world. Bin Laden is a wealthy Saudi businessman turned holy warrior. He's trained a generation of freedom fighters for Islamic extremism. The U.S. blames him for many attacks, including explosions in 1998 outside 2 U.S. embassies, one in Kenya, the other in Tanzania. By midday today, U.S. security personnel were saying they had good indications that Osama bin Laden is responsible again. He's considered the only one with an organization large enough to do this. John Ziegler is an adjunct professor of political science at Carleton University.
But this is an enormously sophisticated operation, both from the intelligence point of view as well as the operational one, and that limits the people who could be involved. And of course, most of the fingers are being pointed at Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan.
But Brian Jenkins warns against blaming anyone specifically.
It's always a danger that the analysis will look for someone to point to, and that Osama bin Laden will invariably be our default category. Now, to be sure, Osama bin Laden is responsible for a number of attacks and could not be removed from the list of suspects. But we tend to try to personify terrorism, a faceless phenomenon, and identify it in terms of a single villain.
In the past, the U.S. has reacted swiftly and brutally to attacks against it. In 1998, American cruise missiles slammed into a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. The State Department said Osama bin Laden was making chemical weapons there. The U.S. shot missiles at bases in Afghanistan that it claimed were training camps for bin Laden's people. The attacks were also to retaliate against the bombing of the U.S. embassies. But going to war against terrorists is not like conventional war.
The difficulty with this one is Osama bin Laden has never taken credit for any terrorist attack and says that it's only the anger at the United States that provokes people to take these responses, and has not claimed any credit for it. And he's not likely to claim any credit for this one in that sense. So no one's taking responsibility, therefore the target is invisible.
Buildings were still burning in Manhattan and Washington today when Americans were talking about revenge.
I think it's a disgrace, and I think President Bush should act immediately, without hesitation, of the Pentagon, and nuke every terrorist state in the world.
I think that anger will demand some type of response that is considered appropriate, although I don't know what response can be and in what measure we would calculate appropriateness here. This is a major attack on the United States itself. We have never in our history suffered a blow of this magnitude.
Likely target for the U.S. would be Afghanistan, where it's believed the Taliban government gives refuge to Osama bin Laden. Taliban has denied any involvement. So has every other terrorist organization in the world. Without blaming anyone, President Bush only suggested retaliation would be swift and decisive.
But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test.
The political rhetoric out of the U.S. today suggests a lot has changed. The anti-terrorism campaign of the past is now called a war. U.S. politicians and pundits declared that anyone who harbors America's enemies will now have to pay the price. But identifying who or what the enemy is will be the first order of business. For The National, I'm Carol Off.
Even as that work of identifying who the enemy is goes on, of course, there's another very bit of important work going on at the World Trade Center site at this hour. And we have some of the latest pictures back of the devastation that rescue crews have to work through. You heard about the debris, the dust, the papers, all of the destruction around them. We know that on a normal Tuesday with 50,000 people in the 2 towers of 110 floors, you can imagine what people are going through there now, and a search and recovery effort that will take weeks.